Ferdinand Christian Baur was a German Protestant theologian and founder and leader of the Tübingen School of theology. Following Hegel's theory of dialectic, Baur argued that second-century Christianity represented the synthesis of two opposing theses: Jewish Christianity and Gentile Christianity. This and the rest of Baur's work had a profound impact upon higher criticism of biblical and related texts. Adolf Hilgenfeld followed Baur's lead and edited the Tübingen School's journal, though he was less radical than Baur. A patristic scholar and philosopher at Tübingen, Albert Schweigler, gave the school's theories the most vigorous expression. The school's influence peaked in the 1840s, but was waning by the early 20th century. Baur's views were revolutionary, but one thing is certain: New Testament study, since his time, has had a different color. He had a number of followers, who in many cases modified his positions, and the groundwork laid by Baur continues to be built upon in the 21st century. Early years. Baur was born at Schmiden, near Cannstatt. After training at the theological seminary of Blaubeuren, he went in 1809 to the University of Tübingen. Here he studied for a time under Ernst Bengel, grandson of the eminent New Testament critic Johann Albrecht Bengel, and at this early stage in his career he seems to have been under the influence of the old Tübingen school. But at the same time the philosophers Johann Gottlieb Fichte and Friedrich Schelling were creating a wide and deep impression. In 1817 Baur returned to the theological seminary at Blaubeuren as professor. This move marked a turning point in his life, for he now set to work on the investigations on which his reputation rests. He had already, in 1817, written a review of G. Kaiser's Biblische Theologie for Bengel's Archiv für Theologie. Its tone was moderate and conservative. Early works. When, a few years after his appointment at Blaubeuren, he published his first important work, Symbolik und Mythologie oder die Naturreligion des Altertums, it became evident that he had made a deeper study of philosophy, and had come under the influence of Schelling and more particularly of Friedrich Schleiermacher. The learning of the work was fully recognized, and in 1826 the author was called to Tübingen as professor of theology. It is with Tübingen that his greatest literary achievements are associated. His earlier publications here treated of mythology and the history of dogma. Das Manichaeische Religionssystem appeared in 1831, Apollonius von Tyana in 1832, Die Christliche Gnosis in 1835, and Über das christliche Platonismus oder Socrates und Christus in 1837. As Otto Pfleiderer observes, the choice not less than the treatment of these subjects is indicative of the large breadth of view and the insight of the historian into the comparative history of religion. Simon Magus and Paul. Ferdinand Christian Baur, the founder of the Tübingen School of New Testament criticism, rested his ideas about the New Testament on the Clementines, and his ideas about the Clementines on Saint Epiphanius, who found the writings used by an Ebionite sect in the 4th century. This Judeo-Christian sect at that date rejected St. Paul as an apostate. It was assumed that this 4th century opinion represented the Christianity of the 12 apostles. Paulinism was originally a heresy, and a schism from the Jewish Christianity of James and Peter and the rest. Marcion was a leader of the Pauline sect in its survival in the 2nd century, using only the Pauline Gospel, St. Luke, and the epistles of St. Paul. The Clementine literature had its first origin in the Apostolic Age, and belonged to the original Jewish Petrine legal church. It is directed wholly against St. Paul and his sect. Simon Magus never existed. It is a nickname for St. Paul. The Acts of the Apostles, compiled in the 2nd century, have borrowed the mention of Simon from the earliest form of the Clementines. Catholicism under the presidency of Rome was the result of the adjustment between the Petrine and Pauline sections of the Church in the second half of the 2nd century. The fourth Gospel is a monument of this reconciliation, in which Rome took a leading part, having invented the fiction that both Peter and Paul were the founders of her church, both having been martyred at Rome, and on the same day, in perfect union. Throughout the middle of the 19th century this theory, in many forms, was dominant in Germany. The demonstration, mainly by English scholars, of the impossibility of the late dates ascribed to the New Testament documents, and the proofs of the authenticity of the Apostolic Fathers and of the use of St. John's Gospel by Justin, Papias, and Ignatius, gradually brought Baur's theories into discredit. Of the original school, Adolf Hilgenfeld may be considered the last survivor. He was induced to admit that Simon Mager was a real personage, though he persisted that in the Clementines he is meant for St. Paul. In 1847 Hilgenfeld dated the original nucleus soon after the Jewish War of 70. Successive revisions of it were anti-Basilidian, anti-Valentinian, and anti-Marcionite respectively. Baur placed the completed form H soon after the middle of the 2nd century, and Schliemann agreed, placing R as a revision between 211 and 230. Other writers dated both H and R to between the 2nd and 4th centuries. R 2nd century. Sixtus Senensis, Blondellis, Nuri, Cotelerius, Natalis Alexander, Cave Udan, Heinsius, Rosenmüller, Flug, Giesler, Friedrich Thorlach, Brettschneider, Engelhardt, G. Frora. R 2nd to 3rd century. Schrock, Stark, Lampe, Crabbe, Lockerer, Gisdorf. R 3rd century. Strunzius, Weissmann, Mosheim, Klucker, Schmidt. R 4th century. Karodi, Lenz. H 2nd century. Kredner, Brettschneider, Kern, Roth. H 2nd century. Clericus, Bose of Brett, Flug, Muncher, Hoffmann, Dollinger, Hilgers, Hayes. H. End of 2nd century. Schrock, Koln, Giesler, Schenkel, G. Frora, Luca. H. 3rd century. Mill, Mosheim, Gallandy, Giesler. H. 2nd to 3rd century. Neander, Crabbe, Baur, Ritter, Paniel, Darney. H. 4th century. Lenz. Hegel's influence. Meantime Baur had exchanged one master in philosophy for another, Schleiermacher for Hegel. In doing so, he had adopted completely the Hegelian philosophy of history. Without philosophy, he has said, history is always for me dead and dumb. The change of view was illustrated clearly in the essay, published in the Tübingen Zeitschrift for 1831, on the Christ party in the Corinthian Church, Die Christuspartei in der Korinthischen Gemeinde, der Gegensatz des Paulinischen und Petrinischen Christentums in der Ältesten Kirche, der Apostel Petrus in Rom, the trend of which is suggested by the title. Baur contends that the Apostle Paul was opposed in Corinth by a Jewish Christian party that wished to set up its own form of Christian religion. Instead of his universal Christianity, he found traces of a keen conflict of parties in the post-apostolic age, which have passed into the mainstream of early Christian historiography. Pauline epistles. The theory is further developed in a later work, Über die sogenannten Pastoral Brief. In this Baur attempts to prove that the false teachers mentioned in the second epistle to Timothy and epistle to Titus of the Gnostics, particularly the Marcionites of the 2nd century, and consequently that the pastoral epistles were produced in the middle of the 2nd century in opposition to Gnosticism. He next proceeded to investigate other Pauline epistles and the Acts of the Apostles in the same manner, published publishing his results in 1845 under the title Paulus, der Apostel Jesu Christi, sein Leben und Wirken, sein Brief und seine Lehre. In this he contends that only the Epistle to the Galatians, First and Second Epistle to the Corinthians and Epistle to the Romans are genuinely Pauline, and that the Paul of the Acts of the Apostles is a different person from the Paul of these genuine epistles, the author being a Paulinist who, with an eye to the different parties in the Church, is at pains to represent Peter as far as possible as a Paulinist and Paul as far as possible as a Petrinianist. Early Christian conflicts. Baur was prepared to apply his theory to the whole of the New Testament. In the words of H. S. Nash, he carried a sweeping hypothesis into the examination of the New Testament. Quote, he considers those writings alone genuine in which the conflict between Jewish Christians and Gentile Christians is clearly marked. In his Kritische Untersuchungen über die kanonischen Evangelien ihrer Verhältnis zueinander, ihren Charakter und Ursprung, he turns his attention to the Gospels, and here again finds that the authors were conscious of the conflict of parties. The Gospels reveal a mediating, a conciliatory tendency on the part of the writers or redactors. The Gospels, in fact, are adaptations or redactions of an older Gospel, such as the Gospel of the Hebrews, of Peter, of the Egyptians, or of the Ebionites. The Petrine Matthew bears the closest relationship to this original Gospel. The Pauline Luke is later and arose independently. Mark represents a still later development. According to Baur, the account in John is idealistic. It does not possess historical truth, and cannot and does not really lay claim to it. Baur's theory starts with the supposition that Christianity was gradually developed out of Judaism. See also list of events in early Christianity. Before it could become a universal religion, it had to struggle with Jewish limitations and to overcome them. The early Christians were Jewish Christians, to whom Jesus was the Messiah. Paul, on the other hand, represented a breach with Judaism, the Temple, and the Law. Thus there was some antagonism between the Jewish apostles Peter, James and John, and Paul the apostle to the Gentiles, and this struggle continued down to the middle of the 2nd century. In short, the conflict between Petrinism and Paulinism is, as Karl Schwarz puts it, the key to the literature of the 1st and 2nd century. Theology. Baur was a theologian and historian as well as a biblical critic. As early as 1834 he published a strictly theological work, Gegensatz des Katholizismus und Protestantismus nach den Prinzipien und Hauptdogmen der beiden Lehrbegriffe, a strong defensive Protestantism on the lines of Schleiermacher's Glaubenslehre, and a vigorous reply to J. Moller's symbolic. This was followed by his larger histories of dogma, Die christliche Lehre von der Versöhnung in ihrer geschichtlichen Entwicklung bis auf die Ostzeit, Die christliche Lehre von der Dreieinigkeit und Menschwerdung Gottes in ihrer geschichtlichen Entwicklung, and the Lehrbach der christlichen Dogmengeschichte. The value of these works is impaired somewhat by Baur's habit of making the history of dogma conform to the formulae of Hegel's philosophy, a procedure which only served to obscure the truth and profundity of his conception of history as a true development of the human mind. Baur, however, soon came to attach more importance to personality, and to distinguish more carefully between religion and philosophy. The change is noticeable in his Epochen der kirchlichen Geschichtsschreibung, das Christentum und die Christlichkeit der drei ersten Jahrhunderte, and die Christlichkeit von Anfang des 4. bis zum Ende des 6. Jahrhunderts, works preparatory to his Kirchengeschichte, in which the change of view was specially pronounced. Death and posthumous publication. Baur died, aged 68, in Tübingen. The Geschichte was published in 5 volumes during the years 1853 to 1863, partly by Baur himself, partly by his son, Ferdinand Baur, and his son-in-law, Eduard Zeller, from notes and lectures which the author left behind him. Friedrich describes this work, especially the first volume, as a classic for all time. Taken as a whole, it is the first thorough and satisfactory attempt to explain the rise of Christianity and the Church on strictly historical lines, i.e., as a natural development of the religious spirit of our race under the combined operation of various human causes. Baur's lectures on the history of dogma, ausführliche Vorlesungen über die christliche Dogmengeschichte, were published later by his son, Tübingen School. The Tübingen School was at the height of its influence in the 1840s but lost ground to historical fact. Since Adolf von Harnack proposed very early dates for the Synoptics and Acts, the Tübingen School has been generally abandoned.